What I want to do tonight is I want to talk a little bit about loon life history, talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we've done with respect to the breeding season, and then make the transition to what we're currently doing and what we're currently finding in Lake Jocassee. By all means, please, I want to try to make this as informal as possible, so please do feel free to interrupt me at any time with a question that you might have. Again, I've been going up and down the mountains today, so my ears are popping, so I don't know how loud I am, but if I need to be a little bit louder, I can definitely do that for sure, with apologies. And I also did want to say that, again, I teach at Ohio Northern University, which is about an hour south of Toledo. And so my email address is up here, but afterwards, if you do want to correspond with me in any way, please feel free to do so, either via email, by sending me a note, or even just through KM Brooks. I'm sure they're glad to answer your questions, as will I. So I guess I want to start with the creature of habit that I've been really fortunate to have been able to work with now for over 30 years, and that's a bird called the common loon. And as many of you probably are familiar with, at least with respect to the breeding plumage, they're a pretty charismatic bird. They're pretty, well, I guess I'm kind of biased a little bit in that I think they're probably one of the most beautiful birds that we'll find in the North American continent. And as most of you may know, they are a water bird, so you're going to find them pretty much all of the time in or around water. The only time you'll see them on land, at least if they're healthy loons, is when they're on their nest. Other than that, you should not see them on land. And that's primarily because they're a fish-eating water bird. And you can see that this loon's caught one here. I don't think this is at Jocassee. I think this is somewhere in Vermont, but nevertheless, they are underwater visual predators. They will seek and look for fish underneath the water, pursue them, catch them, and either swallow them whole underwater, or as in the case here, bring it up to the surface, rearrange the fish so it can swallow it head first and choke it down, so to speak. And there are a number of adaptations that have made them very proficient underwater foragers, and some of them are shown in this diagram. The first thing that you'll see is that this loon kind of looks kind of flat in the water, and that's because it's able to compress its body belly to back, and that allows it to cut through the water pretty well with a very little amount of drag. So that allows it to cut through water and propel itself, only using its feet to get through the water. The second thing that you'll see in this figure is if you look at the feet on the loon and the legs of the loon, you'll see that they're actually really far back on the bird's body. And that's to allow it to basically extend a full range of motion with respect to being able to twist its leg and basically get itself through the water. A loon can actually turn about 270 degrees on a dime in order to catch a fast-moving perch, walleye, bass, you name it, underwater, and they have to be pretty adept to do that. We'll talk about some of the consequences of that in a second. But the third thing that you don't see in this diagram is that loons actually have relatively dense bones. Some people say they're pretty much solid, and that's unlike most birds. As many of you might know, birds in general have hollow bones, and that allows them to reduce their body weight and make the costs of flying a lot less. Well, as you can imagine, if my bones are full of air and I'm trying to dive to depths as far as 200 feet or so, that air could be a problem. That buoyancy can make it kind of difficult for a bird to reach great depths. And so having very dense, if not completely solid bones allows loons to reach great depths, but it does come at costs. And if you've ever seen a loon try to take off from the water before, you know it's not just like a gull jumping into the air or a cormorant even getting into the air. They need a running start. And so basically you'll see loons when they're about to take off, just like airplanes in the runway before they take off from Greenville or Raleigh-Durham, they'll basically get into a tailwind and they'll line themselves up sort of in a row and take a running start into the wind to get enough lift. And they might actually have to take a couple laps around to get enough speed to get going in order to clear the tree line to get to where they need to go. So being an underwater diver and a pretty proficient fisher comes at one cost. They're pretty poor at flying. They actually have a very high wing loading, which is basically the ratio of the body weight to the wing area. So it takes a lot to get up in the air. It's not a trivial thing. The other thing is that, again, they don't really walk very well on land. And in fact, If you've ever seen a loon try to get up on a nest, it's pretty comical. Maybe that's why they're called loons in the first place. They actually have to sort of propel themselves up into the nest by sort of pushing their bodies forward, sometimes very, very slightly standing up. But basically that center of gravity pushes them down or pulls them back down onto the nest. So as a result, they're very awkward when it comes to getting onto land. And so as a result, they're going to nest right along the shoreline. And that's actually so that they can get away from any type of predator that might want to pick them off, whether it be terrestrial or in the case of a very abundant bald eagle population coming from above. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Loons are charismatic macrofauna, especially if you have been in the northern part of North America. If you've been to New England or the northern Midwest into Minnesota or northern Wisconsin, or if you've gone to Canada, you know it's a pretty emblematic bird. If you've looked at a lot of the license plates, conservation plates in Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin or Maine, you'll see that most of them have a loon on it. You'll also see, if you've been to Canada and spend a little money, you'll be paid back in dollar coins that are called loonies, which is shown here on the bottom, which is on the tail side of the coin. You'll actually see that opposite the queen, I'm guessing the king to be soon, on their coins, you'll actually see a loon profile in the water. Even the state bird of Minnesota, as you might know, is the common loon, and so if you do have that state quarter, flip it over, you'll see a little loon on that dollar. So they've been everywhere. There's even a minor league baseball team called the Great Lakes Loons out of Michigan, that if you want to catch a game and get a baseball jersey with a loon on it, you can do that for sure. But there are also species that are very, very important to a lot of the indigenous peoples in northern North America and to Canada, especially the Inuits. They have been always an emblem of an abundance of food resources, so following loons always would lead a lot of these peoples to abundant food sources, and so it was a very much revered bird and still is in these cultures. There are a lot of lores and legends. I won't go through all of them with respect to the connection between the loon and the survival and the sustainability of these populations. There's even a couple postage stamps that sort of convey some of those lures, and there are some stories, again, the blind boy and the loon, basically the loon guiding the blind child down underwater to help them find foraging fish, and unfortunately leads to the demise of his sister and his mother, but that's a story for a different day. But there are a lot of neat little stories coming out of these cultures. And loons are a very important resource for these peoples too. This is actually a parka, a child's parka, made out of loon feathers, and you can see that. Again, the waterproof of the water repellency of the skin and of the feathers, the insulation that the skin provides creates this ability to make these down coats. And this is actually from a museum in Manitoba, taken from that. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is loons play a very important cultural role, as well as a very important livelihood role with respect to a lot of these cultures and these peoples in northern Canada. For me, I really got hooked on the loons spending my summers in a cabin with my family in northern Ontario, about 2.5 hours north of Sault Ste. Marie. So if you're familiar with Michigan, and Pam, you were showing me your mitten about up here if we're talking about Michigan, and you can sort of see this is the lake where I grew up on, at least spent my summers, Ranger Lake, which not as mountainous as what we see down here for sure, but all the north shore of this lake, which is roughly 25 miles long, was all what they call crown land, which basically is conservation land. And there was no plumbing, no electricity, and basically 2 hours away, again, from civilization. Great place for a young boy to wake up every day and listen to the loon music that's out there. I always used to say, and I hope this is, we'll keep it close here, but walking by starlight to get to the outhouse when I needed to. It was that type of an environment. But nevertheless, I really got hooked. It also led me to, at least as an undergraduate student at Hiram College, which is in northeastern Ohio, to really connect with some of the loon biologists out there. This individual is still alive. Her name is Judy McIntyre. She is known reverently as the Loon Lady. She wrote the book, if you want to call it that, on loon biology, which is shown right here, and I want to make sure I give a plug out to that book because you can get it on eBay for $3 or $4, and it's worth the purchase, called the Common Loon, Spirit of the Northern Lakes, published in 1988. She also wrote an article that made the cover of National Geographic in 1989. And basically by reading that book and reading that magazine and writing a letter to Judy, I got to spend a summer in the Adirondacks in this cabin with her, really being taught the lessons of really being able to study loons as a behavioral ecologist, which is what I claim myself to be as a professor again at Ohio Northern. But an interesting figure from Judy's book really piqued my interest as a young college student and still does today. This diagram depicts the breeding range and the wintering range of the common loon. The grayish blue represents the extent of the breeding range. Again, it extends throughout much of the northeastern part of the continental U.S., through the Midwest, and again up and through Alaska. There are some isolated populations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem region here, and also in northern Washington, Idaho, and Minnesota. For the most part, the wintering range, indicated by the orange, extends along marine waters of the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico. I'll come back to this little blurb right here, and we'll talk more about this because Jocassee plays an important role now with respect to freshwater wintering habitat. But what I want to direct you to right now is this actual little bar right here that you might see going through northern Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. That is the former southern breeding range of the common loon as of about 1928. So when this book was published in 1988, and again with the current, well at least in 1988, breeding range and wintering range, that really represents about a 60-year regression of the breeding range in a relatively short amount of time. And I thought, wow, that is crazy. It's probably not a coincidence that the regression of this breeding range probably went further north due to the huge amount of, well, development of a lot of these lakes and a lot of the shoreline associated with vacation renters or vacation people and individuals on these lakes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. As you can imagine, for an environment where the water and the lake ecosystem is really important for loons, having speedboats coming by or wake boats, you guys are getting those now down here, I'm guessing, that create these huge wakes have been pretty problematic to loons. Loons have definitely been hit by jet skis, water skiers, boats, and these wake boats, which actually flood nests, which is a story for a different day, poses one significant threat to loons. Also, I don't want to say irresponsible, but angling activities that have, well, maybe not been so, I don't know what the right word is.
Irresponsible.
Maybe, and I don't want to. I think angling is very important, and it brings a lot to the management of these areas. But as you can imagine, if you've caught a loon, and what the first thing you do is you actually cut the hook or cut the line, and basically let the loon suffer here, you definitely, without letting anybody know, you run into some issues. And you can kind of see what's happened here. The loon's taken a bait. Basically, the anglers cut the line. And it's really preventing the loon from actually waterproofing its feathers. As many of you probably know, there's an oil gland near the rear end of the bird that it uses to waterproof the feathers. That basically keeps it from getting into hypothermic types of situations. And because this lure is sort of hanging in there and all this line's there, the bird's not able to access that preen gland. And you can kind of see how mottled he looks because he's not able to keep those feathers, well, waterproof, and that's a problem. There are also some other issues that loons are facing that we can't see directly from the outside. This is actually an x-ray of a loon from a colleague named Mark Pokris at Tufts University Veterinary School. And what it shows here is a loon that's actually ingested lead tackle. As many of you might know, lead is a toxin, and a lot of the weights and a lot of the jigs that a lot of fishermen use contain that lead. And unfortunately, either by ingesting those hooks or ingesting those lead weights as possibly gizzard stones, loons succumb to lead poisoning, and you can kind of see that here. Loons are also, unfortunately, still being shot senselessly. You can see this is another X-ray of another necropsy of a loon, and you can kind of see here all this little points here taken from a steel or lead shot that's been used. So somebody thought it was fun to actually shoot a loon either while it's flying or while it was trying to surface, and that's unfortunately done the loon in. They can swallow a lot of things and break them up, but unfortunately lead's the big problem. But so you can actually see in the gizzard here, here's a bolt that it's eaten and a couple of hooks. That was no problem for the loon. It was the lead shot that really did it in. There are a lot of other factors that are really threatening loon populations, especially in their breeding areas. As you might know, climate change is playing a significant role in aquatic ecosystems, not just with respect to lake level fluctuations and algal blooms, but also with respect to some potential pathogens like black flies. I don't know how bad you guys get black flies down here, but if you head up to northern Canada and you can kind of see this poor loon incubating his or her eggs, and its face is really covered with black flies. Could you imagine having black flies going around your eyes and you're wanting to jump in the water there, but unfortunately you've got some eggs sitting underneath you to be able to do that. So there's a lot of threats that are being posed to loons, not just to even survive the breeding season, but to be productive. As you might know, common loons usually have 1 or 2 chicks each year, and both mom and dad are involved with caring for the chicks for roughly 8 to 10 weeks. The incubation period is roughly about 25, 28 days. The post-hatching period, roughly 8 to 10 weeks. That doesn't give you much time to have reproductive failure. So if by the 4th of July we don't have chicks on a lot of these lakes, it's usually not a good sign in terms of being productive during that year. But one cool thing that you might know is that one way in which the parents take care of the chicks is that, at least when the chicks are actually small and little cotton balls, more or less, the parents will carry little chicks on the back as they feed them, which is kind of cool right here. But not all is peaceful and serene, as you might suppose, by listening to a loon on the lake. Loons are very aggressive and very territorial to one another, and they do engage in these active fights. These 2 males right here are grabbing onto each other and beating the tar out of one another with their bills. Unfortunately, these contests for territories can actually be so severe that the loons can actually kill one another. And with a decline in the availability of breeding habitat, it's probably not a surprise that in some areas these events occur more frequently, and as a result, loons are actually dying with respect to some, well, not self-imposed, but intra-specific or between loon types of activities. So what I was really interested in as a graduate student, and Brooks alluded to this, is ways in which loons can try to settle these types of disputes without having to engage in potentially fatal fights. So again, I was really involved with vocal communication, acoustic communication, and really learning more about the loon vocal repertoire. And so that leads me to briefly talking about this yodeling. So what we have here is a breeding pair, and you can kind of see the females up there on the top, and the male who's banded, and you can kind of see he has his own combination of little rings or plastic leg bands with their individual colors on them, and he's yodeling right in front of me, which is kind of cool. But what really I was interested in is the role that these yodels play in selecting and defending breeding territories. As you might know, there are 3 long-distance, high-amplitude calls that are given by loons. One is called the wail, the second is called the tremolo, and the third again is called the yodel. And if you're really interested in all these vocalizations, I want to get a shameful plug to a record that was published back in 1979 by Bill Barklow called Voices of the Loon. Still out there in vinyl if you have a vinyl player. I'm guessing most of you don't, but some people are going back to that. There are CDs, there are tapes out there. And if you talk to me nicely, I've also pirated onto make a digital file. So I can give it to you, but you can't say where you got it from. This is being recorded too, isn't it? Not good. So what I want to do is just briefly give you a brief introduction into loon speak. So if you hear these vocalizations out on Jocassee or some other lakes, you'll know what vocalization you're listening to. What I have here is a picture of a loon giving each of these calls. And what you're seeing down here in the lower right is what's called a sound spectrogram. What it's depicting is the change in the pitch of the call over the course of time. And I don't know, are you guys using, what do they call it now, Merlin from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to listen to bird songs? And you ever listen to one and you see the little spectrogram going as you go? If not, let me know. But that's essentially what this is, just in color. So if you've ever done those little recordings before, that's exactly what you're listening to. The first call I'm going to make here or show you is what's called a wail. And I'm going to try to play it here if I can touch this. You hear that? Let's try it again. It's a pure tone, so it's something that sort of sounds like a cry. And it can actually just be one note, ooh, or it can rise in pitch and fall back down. And it's kind of like a lonely sound, doesn't it? It makes you feel kind of serene and that nature's out there. Some people get scared by it, but they shouldn't. unless the loon's coming at you. But it's a call that's given both males and females. And it's, again, a very relatively high amplitude. It's quite loud. And they're often given when the pair's been separated from one another or when they've been separated from their chicks. So what we believe it is a contact call. Sort of like a, where are you? Here I am. I hear you. Here I come. And eventually they come back together. Okay? Not always, but generally that's what we think it is. So we think it's a long-distance social contact type of a call. The second call that I'm going to talk about is called the tremolo. And as you might know, tremolo means to bounce back and forth in frequency or to reverberate, and that's what this sound does. It's a frequency modulated or sort of a wavering call that's again given by both males and females, and you can see structurally that kind of fluctuation in the pitch. So it's kind of referred to as the laugh of the loon. And I'll try to play that. Try it again. I don't know what I'm doing. There we go. Did you hear that laugh? That's given again by both males and females. Again, it's high amplitude, so you should be able to hear it from quite a distance. And really what we do is we often hear that call when the loons appear to be in distress. Some people think it's a courtship call. When they're getting close to the birds, they'll hear the male and the female give those calls, and they say, hey, that's really cute. They're talking back to one another, and they're sort of courting for this year's nesting attempt. That's probably not what's happening. What they're probably doing is working together to say, hey, do you see that? I see that. Let's get away from this. I'm with you. Let's keep going. So if you do hear tremolos, that's usually a sign that perhaps you're too close to the loons and you probably need to turn away and give them a little bit of time to calm down. So again, it's alarm and a distress type of a signal. The one call, again, I was really interested in as a graduate student is called the yodel, and I've got a video to try to demonstrate that. In this situation, we've got a male and a female, and you can kind of see males in general are a little bit bigger than the females. In Wisconsin, where I was, males usually between 4 and 5 kilograms, so roughly 8 to 10 pounds. Females usually between 3,000 and 4,000. Grams, so about 6 to 8 pounds. What we're going to do is see a male give a yodel call right in front of us, I hope, by clicking it. And he's yodeling at me. He's giving me what for. I taunted him a little bit to get him to do that. You squeeze them hard enough, they'll do that for you. But this call's a little bit different, and there are different people who have tried to describe it, and I don't know how good they're doing at that. I don't know how if you can say, oh, Ali, Cleopiarit, Cleopiarit, Cleopiarit. That kind of sounds me when I've gotten up too early in the morning. But nevertheless, it's a little bit of a different call because it's pretty complex compared to the other two I showed you. It's not just this back and forth or this pure note. And we think there's a lot of information in this. If you ask me to come back and talk about loon calls as a whole, I can do that for over an hour. Trust me, it's not that exciting. But long story short, what we have found is that the loons are probably saying a lot, and it's only given by males. So the females don't give this call. And we think what males are saying is who they are. It's me, Bob. They're saying something about how cheesed off they are. I'm really angry at you. And they're also saying this is the type of fight you're going to have to put up with. Okay, so it's Bob, I'm angry at you. And this is how big and strong I am. And how they do that is actually by giving this call either in the crouch posture that you saw that last bird in the video, or sometimes if the birds get really close enough to one another, they assume this vulture posture, and they stand up in the water and paddle, and they yodel at each other, which this is actually a dad and his son, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of neat. So they'll give yodels at anybody, including their own kin, which is kind of cool. But long story short, what you'll see is that there is a note in that yodel that basically is represented by this symbol, which is in the paper here. But it's basically a note that's pretty much constant, and it transmits a pretty far distance. And what's kind of cool about that is that it communicates something about body size. Long story short, just like people, if you're big and you're really healthy, that note's going to be really low in pitch. And if you're not healthy or you're smaller, it's going to be really high in pitch. And that's a way in which loons can actually size one another up. And hopefully, if you can establish who's going to probably win that fight before you have to get into a fight, then you've probably saved enough energy, or saved perhaps your life, and you've probably saved a lot of costs with respect to fighting for a territory. But I digress a little bit. If we have been able to select our territory, if we've been able to nest successfully, if we've been able to hatch those chicks, and if we've been able to get to 8 to 10 weeks, roughly late September, early October, into the breeding season, you have an adult with a happy little baby chick that's about ready to be off on its own. And you can kind of see that these chicks look a little bit different than a wintering adult, and I'll show you that in a second, by the fact that these guys have these little concave scapular feathers or shoulder feathers. And these feathers, at least for a first year bird, are very round. And you won't see that with a lot of birds that are older. So this chick's just about ready to be fledged on its own. Parents will abandon him, and he'll basically find another lake and hopefully group up with a bunch of other little chicks and make their way south. And hopefully what you'll see is before the ice comes in, because ice is not good for a loon, especially if you're trying to get off or take off on an aquatic on a big, large body of water, that can be a problem. So these guys have to make that trip, and they have to head south. And where do they go again? Well, it's pretty much the same map here, but the colors are a little bit different. As indicated by the blue, these guys are going to be heading again to the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, and the Gulf of Mexico. And the direction by which they primarily do that is indicated by this diagram, as indicated from banding records and from putting little satellite telemetry units on loons. We find most of the birds that summer in the western part of North America migrate primarily to the Pacific Ocean. And the birds that spend their summers in the central and eastern part of North America head to the southeast or due east. And what we find is that they usually head to where the nearest water is. So if a bird is spending its summer in Maine, all it needs to do is go to the Atlantic Ocean, probably 100, 200, 300 miles away. Birds that are in Ontario or in Manitoba or in Minnesota and Wisconsin, well, these guys actually head to the Great Lakes and then head south through this part of the world. And a lot of the birds that we have seen from these states, or at least found in the Gulf of Mexico, are indeed coming from Wisconsin and Minnesota and Ontario. It's not a trivial event. During the migration period, especially on the Great Lakes, especially with some of the invasive species and climate change that's going on, there have been large outbreaks of botulism that have occurred, and we can talk more about that perhaps at a different day, that has killed a lot of loons en route to perhaps Jocassee and perhaps to the Gulf of Mexico. If the birds actually do make it to their wintering grounds, they literally aren't out of the water yet. There are large predatory fish that would love to have a loon snack. A lot of sharks out there. In fact, this one was probably bit by a shark. You can sort of see the trail of blood that it's left behind in the sun or sand here as it's flopped itself onto the beach. And again, a loon on land is not a healthy loon. This is an injured one that was, again, probably bitten by a shark. There are also some other things to think about when you're migrating to the ocean. One is you're going from a freshwater lake during the breeding time to a saltwater environment during the winter, and your physiology is changing, if you can think about that. Basically swimming and eating a lot of freshwater fish and things like that, to basically going to Florida for a marine life, at least for the next 4 or 5 months. So a lot of loons will actually shift their prey base, going from a lot of fish that they're eating during the summer to perhaps some crustaceans, and that can lead to some parasites and other things that can pose threat to loons. So what's Jay trying to say? Migrating south and heading to the Gulf of Mexico or heading to the Atlantic Ocean also poses threats that we really haven't looked at and we really haven't thought about as much as we have on these nice pristine lakes where we have our pair of loons. Really, relatively speaking, the migratory staging areas where loons spend part of their falls and in their spring has not been looked at very well, as has the winter ecology. And we need to know more about that because we are losing a lot of loons to some of these predators, some of these diseases, some of these changes that occur naturally. One other thing to think about, and this is probably why we haven't seen, at least historically, a lot of birds spending their winters on freshwater lakes, is that loons will actually undergo a complete remedial molt during the late winter, early spring. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they actually lose all their flight feathers at once. So you can see this bird is up and flapping its wings here. This is, I don't think this guy's on Jocassee. He might have been down in the Gulf. But you can sort of see here that it's lost all of its flight feathers. And you can imagine for a bird that's basically foraging and not very good, a heavy bird that forages for fish, doesn't do a very good job flying in the first place. If it's lost its flight feathers, it can't fly anymore. So there's actually a period in, again, late December through February and into March where a lot of these birds can't fly. Okay? And you can imagine what that problem could be, right? You're sort of stuck where you are. You can't fly from Jocassee over to Kiwi. You can't go to Hartwell. Goodness knows you can't make it to the ocean. So where you decide to overwinter is not trivial for these guys. And you don't want to be on a lake, especially with this molt going on, that's going to freeze, right? You're done for. Okay? And in fact, a lot of birds will become iced in and they have to be rescued by people going out in airfoils or taking rafts, picking them out of the water, or picking them off the ice and taking them to the ocean. Again, we don't know much about what loons are doing during the winter. And basically what these diagrams represent is basically what we call the activity budget of a loon. It's basically an overview of how they're budgeting their time into general behavioral categories. These are basically activity budgets represented by pie graphs of loons that were observed wintering in Virginia here and in Florida here. Each of these little colors, and I'm sorry they're not coming out too well here, represents a different activity of the loon. Okay? This darker green represents foraging. This next to dark green represents preening, locomotion, and resting. So basically what we're seeing here is we break down the activity of the loon. What we're seeing is that they spend roughly 50 to perhaps 2/3 of their time foraging. So they're doing a lot of that. Okay? That's pretty important because you're going to be building up reserves for spring migration. You're going to be growing those new feathers, not just the flight feathers, but these important ones that are going to be for breeding, and making your way off of these lakes as soon as you can. Well, that leads us to learning a little bit more about the differences between what we're seeing in marine environments and this part of the world here. And so this is really, I think, fascinating to me that there is part of the world now where loons, again, aren't wintering in the marine waters of the Atlantic, Pacific, and the Gulf, but they're deciding to spend their winters here in Jocassee and some of these larger freshwater, larger bodies of freshwater in the southeastern United States. I should probably have Brooks and Kay introduce you to Lake Jocassee. I don't even know why I have this slide up here, but I think most of you know, if you've been to Lake Jocassee, it was created, if I remember right, dammed in 1968, but it filled up with water in 1973, or was I close?
Right.
No, what was? I got it? Wow. A minus, right? Yeah, it took me a minute. As you might know, there are some major tributaries to Lake Jocassee. I won't go through all of those. My guess is that all of you know what those are. And if not, make sure you come with us sometime so that we will teach you all of those and the importance of those areas. It is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I guess I'm a little bit biased because it's got loons on it. But there are some people that come there for the first time and never leave, right? From what I hear. Okay. Beautiful place to be. Again, Kay and Brooks will give it more justice than I would with respect to it being one of the most beautiful places on the earth. I've had the luxury with some of you, Hayward here, Tim, a lot of people really showed me how beautiful it is and shared this with me. And I try to do that as a Yankee to a lot of people up in Ohio. Yeah, and it's an area where a lot of fresh water, cold water comes into the lake that can be very helpful for the loons. It's a very oligotrophic lake, meaning that it's very clear. It has been stocked by the Department of Natural Resources with a number of species of fish that are fantastic for the loons to forage on. Oh, I probably don't need to say much about coney bells. You probably have a better lecture on that than I do. I should have taken that slide out right now. But it's a great time of year to come and visit. And even on the days where it is overcast and cold and rainy, it's still a gorgeous place to be. And there are loons there. So in the 7-8 years that I've been fortunate to have been able to come down here, Jocassee has been the home of roughly 120 to 150 loons. So if you go out in Lake Jocassee on a day where we actually survey the lake, you'll probably find on average roughly about 120, 130 loons that will spend their winters there. Some of these loons we have been able to catch and band, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. You can sort of see this guy's got his own little set of rings right there, little license plate so we can tell where he's going and where he's been. One of our birds actually turned up in Minnesota and spends his summers in Minnesota. Somebody called and said, hey, I think we have one of your birds here. I just took a picture of it. Can I send it to you? Sure. Sure enough, there are these bands on it. The bird is spending its summers in Minnesota and spending its winters in Jocassee. The other thing I want to point out here is that this part of the world is actually experiencing higher numbers of loons overwintering. This is a slide that basically depicts data from Christmas bird count data. So my guess is many of you have participated in the Christmas bird count before. It's a survey or a census of birds that many of you have probably done between Christmas and New Year's, or at least around that time of year. The colors in this slide represents whether or not over the last 50 years or so, whether or not Christmas bird count numbers are increasing or decreasing for different species. And this is for the common loon. Blue indicates growing, red indicates declining, and the darker the red, the darker the blue indicates the higher numbers of individuals that are being seen on Christmas bird counts. So what you're seeing here, especially in the east and the southeast, as indicated by the dark blue, many more loons are being reported now. And this is being corrected for sampler effort, so it's being corrected for anything associated with variability in census people and census time. Loons are increasing in these areas in terms of spending their winters here. That's not just true with that graph I just showed you earlier, but this little curve right here. This is actually looking at the average numbers of loons seen per Christmas bird count in the South Atlantic region of the United States. And again, this is over a 50-year period, and what we see is there's definitely a significant trend line there. So there's evidence to suggest that loons are spending more time in the freshwater areas of southeastern United States, and that's probably going to continue, especially in light of climate change. As you might know, back at about 3 or 4 years ago now, the National Audubon Society came up with a climate report looking at different species that are at the risk of becoming imperiled over the next 60 years, so from 2020 to 2080, and loon was one of the poster children for that. What you'll see here is that this is a graph depicting by 20-year increments the shift in both the wintering range represented by the blue and the breeding range is indicated by the yellow that's been projected for the common loon from this report. So what's Jay trying to say with this figure? Well, notice the blue wave, and we're not talking about that Michigan, that city, that state up north, as we say in Buckeye world. Big northern movement of wintering loons. And so really the nice thing about Jocassee is that it also provides a little laboratory for us to begin to understand what's really going on with these loons before we really need to start thinking about protecting environments in, let's just say, Ohio or Michigan or Tennessee, where loons are probably going to become more frequent. Is that making sense? How am I doing? Okay still? Okay. So that's really where we're coming and learning a little bit more about Jocassee. And again, we roughly have between 130 and 150 birds that like to spend their winters there. And they are all in different sizes and different shapes and different plumages, and they probably come from different parts of the country. And one of the things that we've been really looking at so far is really how do the time activity budgets of loons on Jocassee compare with those data that we found in Virginia and what we found in Florida, and how does it compare with breeding lakes? Long story short, what we're going to see is that we're able to track loons through some of the activities of our Jocassee sponsored and Earthwatch sponsored activities to actually follow and track loons and specifically look at the behavioral activity budgets of the loons. And again, this is really spearheaded through really Brooks and Kay Wade, who we really owe a great debt of thanks to in terms of coming up with a way in which we have developed relationships with other loon organizations found throughout the country to actually spearhead research that looks at the wintering biology and behavior of the loons. I've also had the luxury to actually bring students down for 2 weeks. In fact, that's why I'm here right now. I have 14 students that are waiting for me back at the camp near Cashers, where we can come out and begin to look at these behaviors and participate in other activities to not only expose them to this beautiful area, but also get them to think a little bit about loon behavior. In our Spring sessions, one thing that we also do is we bring in loon experts from various parts of the country, and during our evenings we're fed well, and Brooks and Kay can talk more about that, but we also have programs from some of our friends in Minnesota or Wisconsin or Maine or New Hampshire or Vermont or New York to talk about some of the issues that are facing their loon populations in these parts of the world. So it really is an immersive full week of research that we actually conduct with workshops both during the day and during the night. And there's a lot of fringe benefits to working on Jocassee, right? Mm-hmm. You can have your dinner and sit and watch the sunset before we begin our programs. Some nights we do go out, and we've had the fortune to be able to go out and catch and band some of the birds. So I don't know if you can tell what's going on here, but we have our friend Sherry Epps from Minnesota holding our bird, Professor Jim Peruke from St. Joseph's College in Maine, who really deserves a lot of credit here too. And here's my hand here as we're basically holding the leg to put some bands on the bird before we release it back into the wild, which is kind of neat. So we can participate in that sort of activity, and we're able to track some of these birds and watch their activities on Jocassee. We've even done some radio telemetry work. We put radio transmitters on birds on their leg bands that will fall off over time, so we can track them, track their movements, monitor their movements. We basically have everybody in the pontoon boats observing and recording data. Long story short, what we're finding is the activity budgets of loons generally as a whole are pretty much the same as what we see in Virginia and what we see in Florida. That is, roughly about 50% of their time is dedicated to foraging, which allows them to have the remaining 50% of the time to actually preen, sleep, move around, do what loons do. But what's also kind of interesting is that we found that loons do really two different things when they're on Jocassee. We've got some birds that are actually loners. They are antisocial. They're introverts. They really don't want any part of any other loon. That's what we're kind of seeing here. What we also see on the other hand, however, are these groups of loons that like to hang together. And they like to hang together in very loose or very tight flocks or very tight groups. And there are some areas in the lake that religiously have individuals that are either groups or solitary individuals. So what we kind of do is actually begin to observe these behaviors. And what's kind of cool about the social birds is that they appear to be really involved in working together to actually forage for a lot of the small foraging fish, threadfin shad and blueback herring that occupy the shallower waters of the lake but are schooling fish. And what I'm going to show you here is a video really quick, and I'm sorry it doesn't come out too well here because it was shot on my cell phone. But what you'll see is that the loons will work together to actually try to bring these fish up to the surface, and the fish jump out of the water, and they're picking them off as they go along. And it appears to be, dare I say, cooperative type of behavior. So here they come, and I don't know if you can see that, but you see them there going along the surface there, and every once in a while you'll see some fish jump out and they can pick them off. And imagine looking at these with binoculars, you can actually see them grab the fish and pull them in, which is really kind of cool. But see how they're working together? And they're basically going underneath that little bait ball, bringing it up, and getting those little fish to jump out and start picking, okay? What we can actually do is we can actually distinguish statistically our social birds from our solitary. So not to get too scientific-y here, but what we're looking at here is the proportion of an activity budget where our loons are within a 20-meter distance of our focal bird. So if we're watching a bird and we find out, okay, he spends basically 0 to 20% of its time with another loon, that's really what's represented here. From here to here, we're saying that the loons spend 20 to 100% of their time with another loon. So basically this curve right here represents the social birds, and this group represents our solitary individuals, our two different behavioral strategies, if you call them that. And so we've been able to separate those birds statistically through this little figure and the statistics that correspond to it to really differentiate to what we think are behavioral strategies from the loons. Some really are very antisocial and solitary and do their own thing, and very rarely will come into contact with other loons. And basically when they do, they kind of do their own thing and move on, so to speak. And the others sort of work together as a group. Well, if you actually separate these birds out, where we have our solitary birds here and our group individuals here, do you see the big difference in their activity budget, especially with that dark green, that foraging? Our group birds are spending less than 50% of their time foraging, which is really kind of interesting because that could provide enough time for them to do other things to get them ready for migration. In contrast, our solitary birds are basically spending 2/3 of their time foraging, spending much more time foraging and not as much time getting ready for the migration in terms of preening and locomoting and resting and all that kind of fun stuff. What's also kind of cool is that if you actually begin to look at the duration of the dives, you can see, and you might assume, and we're finding this is statistically different. If you look at our solitary birds, the time they spend underwater when they dive to forage for fish, much longer, on average about a minute, just a little bit under. But our group individuals, a lot shorter on average, because they're running into those bait balls and they're making those little short, shallow dives and bringing up those fish. So that raises, at least for me as a behavioral ecologist, a really interesting question. What are the pros and cons of each of these two strategies? Because we've seen birds that are banded come back to the same parts of the lake and be of the same type. So a lot of our social birds come back to the same parts of the lake and they're kind of social. There are one or two solitary birds that come back and we find them usually out in the open water and they adopt that solitary strategy. Well, with our social individuals, what we see is that they're spending less time foraging and they're working together eating a lot of small fish. And what we're seeing with our solitary individuals, they're probably spending long times diving, but when they do come up with a fish, they don't have to share it and they can have that whole thing to themselves. So there's a really interesting to me question about these two strategies. And so as a result, it leads to a lot of questions. Why might that be? Well, one thing that we see is that a lot of our social birds tend to occupy certain parts of the lake, as represented here by the red. Our solitary birds occupy two other parts of the lake. So one thing might be the habitat, and really the birds are site-fidelic, they're going back to the same part, but they're basically taking advantage of the habitat that they're usually using and more, I don't know what the right word is, profitable for that area, okay? But there are other questions out there, and basically to sort of summarize, we know that, again, roughly 50% of the time, birds are spending their time foraging, unless we look at these differences in strategies. About 1/3 of the birds are solitary on Lake Jocassee, and these birds, again, make longer dives and usually come up with big fish. About 2/3 of the birds are group individuals, or if you will, these social birds, and they tend to take this second strategy where they kind of work together to bring up these bait balls and basically consume all these very small fish. So there's a lot of questions that you probably have, and I've really taken too much of your time tonight, and again, I'm very grateful for it. But that gives us years upon years of questions to begin to look at. And so, at least for me, who's really a geek, and again, who's been studying loons for about 30 years now, is there a reason why there's a difference between the strategies? Is that maybe, hey, are all the social birds females, and all of the solitary birds males? That could be one reason to explain the difference. We don't think so, because I've at least heard yodels coming from solitary and from social birds. And remember, males are the only ones who yodel, so I don't think that's it. Could it be difference in age? So the younger birds are coming back and learning how to cooperate with other birds, where maybe the old farts are coming back and going to their favorite hideouts where they know where those trout and bass are found. Is it something associated with the habitat, as I showed you earlier, with respect to different parts of Jocassee being amenable to certain types of food resources? And is it something that has to do with the density of birds that are actually on Jocassee? That is, if you have a certain number of birds, 50 to 100, you might see more social groups and more birds taking advantage of that. So there's a lot of questions there, and I'm sorry, again, late in the lecture I shouldn't have a bunch of text slides. But it really gets us to think about the trade-offs between the solitary strategy and the social strategy. Something I never would have expected by coming to Jocassee in the first place. And something that you can't look at by going to the ocean. Imagine trying to follow loons in the ocean going out to deep water. Jocassee allows us to do that. So long story short, I want you to think a little bit more and perhaps join us in the spring, and I'll let Brooks sort of close us out for today. But there's a lot of questions that I want us to think about with respect to the differences between a freshwater habitat and a marine habitat where we traditionally find loons. Again, I won't go through all of these, but there's a lot of questions that I have concerning what makes Jocassee special. I can think of a ton of them compared to the ocean during the winter, associated with better food availability, not as much salt physiological stress, not as many predators, that would make this place a lot better for a loon than, again, the Florida Panhandle. With that said, I want to sort of thank you all for allowing me to take a little bit of your evening, especially again coming from Ohio, as they say down here, and really begin to think about some of the dynamics that you might see by being on some of these larger bodies of water. And as we begin to molt into our breeding plumage the next year, to think about where our loons go and the role that Jocassee and other freshwater habitats play in such a very important critter and a special bird to me in my life. So with that, I'm